Hi there, welcome to video number 5, where I'm going to talk to you about scene 5 of Streetcar named Desire. The feedback from some of you on the videos was that they were useful, so I'm going to keep going and I'm going to do one for each scene, and then I'm going to do a couple of extra ones, one for context and maybe one for genre and tragedy and things like that. So they will come once we've finished studying the play. I'm trying, as you'll have noticed, to do the video outside in my garden, just for a little bit of a different view. So we'll see how that goes. My hair is already blowing in my face, so it's already starting to become a bad decision. Let's see. Looking at scene 5, we just left a really pivotal moment in the play, didn't we? So at the end of scene 4, Stanley overheard Blanche calling him an ape. And we talked about William's deliberate use of that technique, dramatic irony, didn't we? Where we now know something that one of the characters doesn't. We now know something that Blanche doesn't, which is that Stanley is aware of what Blanche thinks of him, and he's aware that she's trying to split up Stella with Stanley. So I think with scene 5, there are a few things to look at in terms of what Williams is doing, and in terms of how he's presenting conflict in the play as a whole. The first thing is the little scene at the beginning with Steve and Eunice, who are two minor characters, aren't they? But they kind of take centre stage a little bit in this, at the beginning of scene 5, and they have this massive argument, don't they? So the argument is that Steve has been cheating on her with a blonde at the Four Deuces. And she accuses him of not staying downstairs at the Four Deuces and going upstairs instead. I guess that's a reference to maybe using the Four Deuces as a hotel rather than just a bar. For obvious reasons, that would be why Eunice would be upset by that. It's a funny moment because this is not long after the violence between Stanley and Stella, or the violence that Stanley kind of visits upon Stella. But this kind of domestic argument is almost presented as slightly comic here. If not for the audience, then certainly for Stella and Stanley and even Blanche. They kind of laugh at Steve and Eunice's behaviour. Blanche brightly on page 50, did he kill her? They're joking about it, and it says they laugh lightly. But it's hard to see how this is any different from what's happening with Stanley and Stella. Like, there's genuine anger there. There's genuine violence. Eunice's voice shouts in terrible wrath. A disturbance is heard. A clatter of aluminium striking a wall is heard, followed by a man's angry roar, shouts and overturned furniture. Eunice says, "Call the police. I'm going to call the police." Like, it's funny, isn't it, that the same situation is presented as tragic in scene 4, well, in scene 3 and 4, but not in scene 5. One of the ways to look at this moment with Eunice and Steve is that Williams is showing you a little bit, again, like he was doing at the start of scene 1, the world that Blanche has kind of moved into. Which is a world where violence is the norm, which is a world where there's a lot of shouting and crashing and banging. And one of the ways to look at Steve and Eunice, what Williams is doing here, is he's using these characters as a device to show you a little bit about Stanley and Stella and their future. So Steve and Eunice are a little bit older than Blanche and Stanley and Stella, but maybe it's Williams giving you that hint that this is the norm. Like, this play exists in a world where domestic violence and unhappiness and shouting and violent crashing is seen as the norm. So much so that it's become a joke, even to Blanche, who was so horrified by Stanley's treatment of Stella before. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, if we look at the conflict between Stanley and Blanche, we see something perhaps a little bit unexpected, which is kind of subtlety from Stanley. Stanley has not been subtle before now, has he? He's crashed and banged his way around this play. and we would expect, given that he's now overheard Blanche trying to break him up with Stella, we'd expect anger, but there isn't any. Stanley is being sneaky, isn't he? So if you look at how the conflict begins in scene 5, it's not a violent conflict or argument. Really, it's when Stanley says, on page 51, say, do you happen to know somebody named Shaw? Look at the way Stanley's worded that, or the way Williams has used language there. You've got that almost casual kind of discourse marker, that word say, which is kind of a meaningless word, isn't it? It's just a discourse marker. It's just kind of getting Blanche's attention, say. But it's to give that sense of nonchalance. It's to give that sense that he's just maybe saying something that isn't important. Do you happen to know? Look at the modal verb there, happen to know. Not do you know somebody named Shaw, that would be too aggressive. Do you happen to know somebody named Shaw? Just that kind of shade of meaning through the verbs, that modality in the verbs, is giving you this idea that Stanley is pretending that this doesn't matter. But actually, that line, say, do you happen to know somebody named Shaw, is going to send Blanche spiralling for the rest of the play. You could again pin one of the triggers for Blanche's kind of downfall could be pinned to that line. Stanley is saying, I found you out. I know about your past. And that's why her face expresses a faint shock. She answers carefully. Look at all the verbs in the stage directions from Blanche from that moment on. She closes her eyes as if faint on page 52. Her hand trembles, page 52 again. She seems faint. She looks about her with an expression of almost panic. Then later, obviously, she screams in the scene, just a kind of simple spilling of a Coke. So you've got kind of very subtle conflict here. The conflict between Stanley and Blanche is also kind of being played out symbolically underneath the words that they're using as well. So another thing that's happening in this scene is the stuff with the astrological signs. We talked in the Zoom call that we had this week about Williams's use of symbolism, the way he uses symbolism to tell you things about the characters. Look at that conversation on page 51, where it's all very innocent. It's all very kind of presented as just small talk, really. Blanche asks, what astrological sign are you? Even that idea of Blanche's obsession with things like the stars and astrology and things like that, that sums up her character, doesn't it? She's interested in fantasy. She's interested in things like fate. She's interested in more romantic, less concrete things. Stanley is more interested in or he sees himself as much more down to earth, doesn't he? So even if you look at a moment where they're not arguing, you can see the conflict between who they are pouring out of them everything they say to each other. So, for example, Stan on page 51, when she starts talking about astrology, he says contemptuously, ha. Like, that's him bringing her back down to earth, isn't it? It's him saying, no, stop it, stop this nonsense, stop this fantasy. And again, if you have a look at the two signs they are, Williams is being kind of almost jokey and clever with that. Stanley is Capricorn, the goat. In literature, in the history of literature, if you do classics, you might know the god Dionysus, who's an ancient Greek god, who's half man, half goat, and he's the god of drunkenness and wine and sex and partying. And so goats in English literature are often a symbol of that, of kind of sexual excess. So it kind of makes sense that Stanley is Capricorn, the goat, even on a superficial level like that. Also, goats just destroy everything, don't they? They run around knocking things over and smashing things up. Blanche is Virgo the Virgin, which we've seen in her name anyway, with the name Blanche meaning white. And that's one of the reasons why Stanley says ha contemptuously when she reveals she's Virgo the Virgin. Stanley finds that extremely ironic because he's starting to find out about her past. So even in moments between Blanche and Stanley where they're not actively in conflict, who they are is always in conflict, and Williams is always aware of showing you that. Looking at some of these things makes you realise what a clever, intricate writer Tennessee Williams is. Like, he really thinks about every single word. Like, if you want that argument that people have when they have a go at English students and they go, yeah, but a writer couldn't possibly have meant all of those things that you're saying, I think tell that to Tennessee Williams, because he does think about every word, doesn't he? And he thinks about kind of what does this show you about this character. This character is saying something, even something unimportant, like what star sign are you? He still wants to tell you things about characters, doesn't he? Create conflicts. That's my little advert for Tennessee Williams, who I love. Then, later on in the scene, I'm going to try and kind of move through scene 5 and keep all of these videos to 15 minutes or less so that they're useful for you. So just 5 more minutes on scene 5. There's quite a few things. I want to talk about 2 more things. First of all, let's look at Stella and Blanche in this scene. So Stanley leaves after he's really scared her, and he knows he has, just simply by mentioning the name Shaw, by showing her that he's onto her and he's onto her past. Blanche has, I think, some of her most honest moments in the whole play here in scene 5 with Stella now. And I think there's some tragedy here. Blanche spends a long time on page 53 being really honest with Stella about her past and basically admitting that any rumours that Stella hears are true. That Blanche has had this past with lots of men in seedy hotels because she's had no choice. She's needed a leaky roof for protection and shelter, and she's done that by going from man to man. Look at the way Blanche talks about love and relationships here. It's really kind of honest of Blanche. It's one of her most honest moments in the play, the little monologue that she has for Stella on page 53. She talks about all of these things that she is, which is putting on soft colours and softness and femininity. She talks about that and admits to Stella that it's a performance. Look at the way she talks about how she has to pretend to be. The words like seductive, soft colours, temporary magic, shimmer and glow, put a paper lantern over the light. Look at those words, those verbs, shimmer, glow, those abstract nouns, colours, magic, those adjectives like temporary and seductive. She realises, she recognises, she's honest with Stella about the conflict deep within her about who she is. Because Blanche is 2 things at once, isn't she? And one of her tragedies is that she can't reconcile those 2 things. Blanche is pragmatic and she understands that sometimes you have to be cynical in relationships. If you haven't got any money or any shelter, you can pretend to be seductive and soft and you can get shelter for the night. But the price you pay is you lose your reputation. So Blanche wants to present herself as this kind of feminine, Southern belle, virginal kind of figure who Mitch would be very happy to take home to his mother. But she also recognises that she has to put on a pretense in order to be that. I think it's actually a really feminist moment, I think, in the play. It's perhaps not a word that Williams would have used himself, because this was in the late 40s, but this is a moment where, you know, the double standard and the expectations, the unfair expectations that were placed upon women at this time are being almost directly referred to, which is this idea that Blanche has to be 2 things at once. She has to be this kind of beautiful, innocent virgin, but she also, in order to survive, has to be sexual as well, and she can't ever be both of those things at once. I think what's tragic about this is that Stella doesn't listen to her. Stella says, "I don't listen to you when you are being morbid," after she's finished that really honest moment where she's talked about what she had to do in order to survive. That's maybe quite a devastating moment for Blanche, because Stella is the only person really who's on her side. Stella is the only person really she can be honest with to that level, and Stella kind of does not kind of listen to her, doesn't help her at this moment where she's really saying she's desperate for help. So that's that bit. Just very lastly, it's worth looking at Blanche and the young man, because Williams is interesting here, because I think he wants to create characters who are flawed. You know, it's not simple enough to say that anyone in this play is wholly good or bad or right or wrong, until the rape from Stanley. But until that moment, everyone in this play has their own perspective, don't they? So Williams does all this work making us feel sympathy for Blanche and making us understand why she's behaved the way she has. And then he turns her into a creepy predator at the end of this scene with the young man. And he really goes for it. It's for the time, I guess, for the kind of late 40s, early 50s, he really is skirting the line between kind of innuendo and kind of going over the top. Look at the way she treats this young man. Like, you didn't get wet in the shower. So the young man is coming in from the rain, and you've got this kind of setting up of a romantic cliche of like two lovers kissing in the rain or kissing after the rain. But it's like this warped, twisted version of it where Blanche is this older predator and he's trying to leave, and she keeps kind of inventing reasons for him to come back. So it's like, could you give me a light? What's the time? She keeps like, don't you love these long rainy afternoons? You didn't get wet in the shower. She keeps trying to kind of lure him back. And look at the language that she uses when she mentions, what did you have did you have a soda? A chocolate soda? No, a cherry soda. You make my mouth water. It's quite explicit, that, isn't it? And I think if you look at the symbolism of cherry to do with virginity, Williams is making it really clear symbolically that Blanche is predatory here. Look at the fact that she calls him honey lamb. Think about a lamb. Think about that idea that he's a lamb to the slaughter, and how Williams might be subverting traditional gender stereotypes about sexual aggression, where like he's the lamb, this young man is the lamb, and Blanche is the predator trying to get him. And then the creepiest line in the whole play, where she talks about how, run along now, I've got to be good. It would be nice to keep you, but I've got to be good and keep my hands off children. And then, just as the final bit of hypocrisy, Mitch comes round the corner for their date, having no idea that she just kissed this young man, and she makes him bow and present flowers like a traditional kind of cavalier, medieval kind of cavalier. So it's a really weird scene, because our sympathy wildly kind of vacillates between having that for Blanche and not, because we do feel sympathy for Blanche because Stanley is cruel to her, because she doesn't deserve to be shamed for her sexual past. But then we actually see her with this young man behaving in this predatory way, in this way that she knows is wrong. She says, I've got to keep my hands off children. She knows it's wrong. She's done it before. So that's where the conflict comes from in scene 5. Hopefully that was useful for you. I've just gone over the 15 minutes, haven't I? But at least we're under 20. So scene 6 to come next. Thanks very much.